Okay, so ever get that feeling? You know that feeling like we're just kind of skimming the surface of history?
Hmm.
Today's deep dive, well, it takes us from this, like, picture-perfect Irish village all the way to uh, the American West. We're talking, like, uncovering a life practically erased by time, and it's all thanks to this new book, The Ballad of Thomas Patrick Downing.
Yeah, and what's really striking here is how it plucks this guy, just one guy, from obscurity. This guy who was actually there at the Battle of the Little Bighorn,
Right.
but his own story, almost lost completely.
It really is like stumbling onto some hidden chapter in a history book you thought you knew backwards and forwards. And to think it all begins in Adair, County Limerick, Ireland, those rolling green hills,
Right.
that storybook charm.
And that's where Thomas's family had deep roots. I mean, we're talking generations. His own grandfather, he worked as a laborer on the Dunraven estate.
Get out.
Yeah, the very same land that's now that luxurious Adair Manor Hotel.
Wow, talk about a glow up for a property. But knowing that connection, it really makes you think about like the echoes of the past, like here's someone today strolling through these manicured gardens, totally clueless that it all ties back to this soldier who would end up fighting and dying in the American West.
It really underscores just how interconnected history really is. But Thomas's early life, well, it was anything but glamorous. His father was a constable, but he got caught up with suspicion of ties to the Fenian movement,
Oh, right.
the ones fighting for Irish independence.
Ah, so a bit of a rebel in the family.
Yeah.
I can see where Thomas might have gotten that independent streak, but those suspected ties, they must have come with a price, right?
Oh, absolutely. The book details how Thomas's father, he loses his job. The family's feeling the pressure, immense pressure. It ultimately leads to them making the decision to emigrate to America.
And Thomas was how old at this point?
Just 3 years old.
3 years old.
Hmm.
Can you imagine being uprooted like that at that age, shipped off across the Atlantic? You're barely wrapping your head around language at that point, let alone a sense of place.
And the journey over, it was brutal. Just
Yeah.
picture the cramped conditions, the uncertainty. The book even talks about how young Thomas, he witnessed a burial at sea.
Oh, wow.
A young girl, she succumbed to illness during the voyage.
Oh, man, to witness something that profound, that final, at such a young age, it makes you wonder how an experience like that shapes a person's worldview, even if it's just subconsciously.
Yeah.
The fragility of life, that vastness of the ocean, the unknown horizon ahead. That's a lot to process for anyone, let alone a child.
Absolutely. And that feeling, that sense of displacement, of being caught between two worlds, it becomes a recurring theme throughout his life. It's like almost like that ship. It became this like microcosm of his life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Leaving one world behind, facing hardship, facing uncertainty, heading towards, well, who knows what.
And where did they end up? Savannah, Georgia. Talk about walking into a powder keg, Savannah, during the Civil War. That must have been incredibly intense. Paint a picture for us. What was it like for a family like Thomas's to land there at that time?
Well, imagine a bustling port city, deeply rooted in the traditions of the Old South, but now teetering on the brink of war. The city was deeply divided, teeming with Confederate troops. And with the Union blockade tightening its grip, conditions were deteriorating rapidly.
Whoa, a blockade. So it wasn't just the threat of battles. Daily life itself must have been an ordeal.
Absolutely. The Union Navy effectively cut off essential supplies, which led to shortages, skyrocketing prices. Imagine the constant tension, the fear of bombardment from Union ships positioned just offshore.
And here's young Thomas, growing up amidst this chaos. It's one thing to read about the Civil War in history books, but to actually live through it, it boggles the mind.
And remember, we're talking about a family that opposed slavery, landing right smack dab in the heart of the Confederacy. Talk about being caught between a rock and a hard place.
Right. In fact, we read that they lived just blocks from where Alexander Stephens, the Confederate vice president, delivered his infamous cornerstone speech, the one defending slavery. For those of us who might not be Civil War experts, what's so important about this speech?
Well, Stephens was the vice president of the Confederacy. His speech made it crystal clear that the Confederacy was all about white supremacy and justifying slavery. He actually said that the cornerstone of their new nation was the belief that black people were inferior to white people.
Wow, that's heavy stuff. It's such a contrast to what the Downings believed in. Coming from Ireland, I mean, they themselves were escaping oppression, and here they land in a place where another group of people are being denied their basic human rights.
It is a strange twist, isn't it? And the Downings weren't blind to the injustice happening around them. Remember, they came from a place where the British had ruled Ireland with an iron fist. Thomas's father saw the similarities between how the Irish were treated under British rule and how Africans were enslaved in America.
So they're trying to build a new life, but they can't escape oppression and injustice, even in their new country.
Exactly, and this reality really shaped young Thomas.
And it's easy to forget that Savannah, during the Civil War, wasn't just caught in this ideological battle, but was literally under siege.
Oh, absolutely. And the impact on daily life was immense. We're talking food shortages, prices skyrocketing.
Right, you mentioned the Union blockade earlier.
Exactly. And with that blockade, essential supplies were cut off, leading to, well, you can imagine, it was a struggle just to get by.
And on top of all that, the city was just overflowing with Confederate troops. That couldn't have made things any easier on the people living there.
No, not at all. It put an incredible strain on resources, which were already stretched thin as it was. And you have to remember, life in Savannah during the Civil War was, well, it was harsh. Disease was rampant. Sanitation? Poor. And for a young boy like Thomas to witness that kind of suffering, the deprivation, it must have had a profound impact.
Yeah, it's easy to romanticize the past, but the reality was much harsher. So the blockade is in full force, Confederate troops everywhere. And then Sherman's march to the sea. How did that change things for Savannah?
Well, that was a turning point for sure. A pivotal moment, you might say. Sherman and his army had cut a path of destruction across Georgia, and by December of 1864, they were at Savannah's doorstep. It felt like the end had come.
It's chilling to think about. What was it like for Thomas and his family, knowing that Sherman's army was closing in? I mean, Sherman's march,
Hmm.
it's infamous, for its brutality, the burning of Atlanta.
Yeah.
Did Savannah suffer the same fate?
That's where things get interesting. Sherman didn't actually burn Savannah to the ground. He captured it largely intact. Yeah, there's still debate about why he spared the city.
Hmm.
Some historians believe it was strategic. He wanted to preserve it as this vital port. Others say he saw it as, get this, a Christmas gift to President Lincoln.
Wow. A Christmas gift. That's a strange way to think about it.
Right.
But, I mean, either way, Sherman's occupation of Savannah, it really marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy, didn't it?
Absolutely. But it also ushered in a whole new set of complexities for the city, especially for families like the Downings. Imagine the relief. The fighting was finally over, but also the anxiety of being occupied by the Union Army. It must have been a confusing, uncertain time.
Especially for a family that had spent years living under Confederate rule, all the while keeping their anti-slavery views hidden. Makes you wonder how they navigated that transition, what
Yeah.
challenges they faced.
Right. You're absolutely right. They were still outsiders in many ways. In a society grappling with the aftermath of war, a society still, let's be honest, deeply divided along racial lines. And the end of the Civil War didn't magically erase the tensions and inequalities that fueled it in the first place.
Reconstruction, it wasn't some neat and tidy chapter, was it? It was a whole other battleground in a lot of ways.
Very true. It was a messy, often brutal process. And for young Thomas to be growing up amidst all of this, surrounded by these momentous events, well, let's just say it's no wonder he went on to lead such an extraordinary life. The book, it shines a light on this other really chilling event from his childhood,
Oh, no.
a horrific lynching that he witnessed during Reconstruction.
Man, talk about a punch to the gut. Just when you think, okay, maybe things are settling, the country's trying to heal, you're reminded of just how brutal the legacy of slavery truly is. To see something that horrific, that openly cruel, it begs the question, how does anyone, especially a young man, come out of that experience unscathed?
It's a stark and really, really disturbing reminder of the deep scars left by slavery.
Yeah.
The violence, the hatred, it continued to plague Black communities long after emancipation. And for Thomas, think about it.
Yeah.
He's already witnessed so much hardship, so much upheaval.
Right.
This has got to be a profoundly formative experience.
You can't help but wonder if that event, combined with everything else he'd been through, played a role in his decision to enlist in the Army. He was, what, just 16 at the time?
Yeah, just 16.
16 years old.
Imagine this, a
Yeah.
young man carrying the weight of his family's past, his own experiences, all that loss, the displacement.
Right.
And now he's confronted with the harsh realities of Reconstruction-era America. Enlisting. It might have seemed like an escape,
Mm.
a chance for adventure, maybe even a way to find purpose, some sense of belonging, especially in a world that felt like it was spinning off its axis.
Yeah, it's almost like he keeps getting thrust into these pivotal moments in history. Like
Yeah.
each one's layered on top of the last one. And at 16, to see joining the army as the answer, it speaks to that deep need for something solid,
Yeah.
some sense of purpose.
Absolutely. And it's a decision that's going to land him right in the thick of it yet again.
He ends up in the legendary 7th Cavalry, a unit that would become central to the fate of Native Americans in the West.
Yeah, and ironically, their regimental song was Garryowen, named after a place not that far from where Thomas was born in Ireland. It's almost as if his Irish heritage was following him.
But it wasn't all like showdowns at high noon and saloon brawls right off the bat.
Right.
The book, it spends a good amount of time on his service in Kentucky. After the Civil War, what was that all about?
Well, we were talking about those deep scars of slavery.
Hmm.
The South, I mean, it was like a tinderbox at that point, just simmering with resentment. And the Ku Klux Klan, they were gaining traction, terrorizing Black communities.
So you got Thomas, who maybe potentially was facing down Confederate sympathizers as a kid, and now here he is, a young soldier going up against the Klan.
Yeah.
That's intense.
It was a very volatile time. And the book, it doesn't sugarcoat it. There's this one encounter, it's really harrowing, between the Klan and this Black family that Thomas and his unit, they actually managed to stop it.
Man, I'm picking up on this theme with Thomas.
Yeah.
Like he's constantly being confronted with injustice, the worst of humanity.
Mm.
It makes you think about that kind of constant exposure to violence, especially in those formative years.
Mhm. Downing's unit is assigned to protect the U.S. Boundary Commission as they survey the region. Think sub-zero temperatures, blizzards, just a totally different kind of unforgiving environment.
And a different kind of conflict brewing, too. This is where Downing encounters what historical records often call, quote, hostile Indians.
Yeah, it's a very loaded term, isn't it? Definitely reflects the U.S. government's perspective at the time. And we have to remember, this wasn't simply about hostility.
It was about survival.
Exactly. For the indigenous tribes, this was about protecting their ancestral lands, their way of life, their very existence against this relentless tide of westward expansion.
Expansion fueled by the belief in manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was destined to stretch from coast to coast.
Right, and that belief, unfortunately, came at a great cost to the indigenous peoples who stood in its path. Treaties were broken, sacred grounds desecrated, entire communities forced onto reservations.
Reservations that were often a far cry from the fertile hunting grounds they once called home.
Exactly. And this right here, this is the heart of the conflict that will ultimately lead to the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The Lakota Sioux, led by Sitting Bull, were refusing to be confined to those reservations.
And that refusal was seen as a direct challenge to the U.S. government's authority.
Which leads us to 1876. Downing, now a seasoned cavalryman at the age of 20, finds himself marching out of Fort Abraham Lincoln as part of the Dakota Column.
Led by, you guessed it, George Armstrong Custer.
Their mission, to track down Sitting Bull and the Lakota Sioux. And what followed was a series of events that would be forever etched in the annals of American history. But before we get to that fateful battle, we need to understand just what was at stake here for both sides.
Because it wasn't just a military campaign, was it? It was a clash of cultures, a struggle for survival.
A clash that would culminate in one of the most iconic and tragic battles in American history, the Battle of the Little Bighorn.
June 1876. The Dakota Column, with Downing among its ranks, has been relentlessly pursuing Sitting Bull and the Lakota Sioux for weeks.
And they finally locate Sitting Bull's camp along the banks of the Little Bighorn River in what's now Montana. It's important to remember what Custer encountered wasn't just a small band of warriors.
Right. This was a massive gathering of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people, all drawn together by this shared determination to resist being forced onto those reservations.
Estimates suggest there were thousands of Native Americans camped there. Thousands. Far exceeding what Custer and his men were prepared for.
And this is where Custer's judgment, or maybe his ambition, gets the better of him.
Yeah, it really seems that way. It's like he was blinded by this desire for a decisive victory. Custer drastically underestimates the size, the strength of the Native American forces he's up against.
He divides his forces, believing he can outmaneuver, overwhelm the resistance.
A fatal miscalculation.
Custer leads his men into the valley of the Little Bighorn River, totally oblivious to the fact they were about to walk into one of the most famous battles in American history.
And one of the most devastating. They were completely outnumbered, outmaneuvered. Custer and his men, they never stood a chance against the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors.
It's hard to fathom the chaos, The sheer brutality of that battle. Hundreds of soldiers, Thomas Downing among them, lost their lives that day. What must it have been like for those men, many barely old enough to shave, facing such a fierce enemy on their own turf?
It's chilling when you read the accounts. The book doesn't hold back on the brutality. The deafening roar of battle, the smell of gunpowder hanging in the air, seeing your friends, your comrades cut down around you. Terrifying, especially for someone like Thomas, witnessing firsthand the force of Native American resistance.
This is heavy stuff.
It is, it is. And Ryan, he doesn't shy away from any of it. We're right there with Thomas, and as you know, it was a disaster for Custer and his men, Thomas included, unfortunately.
Right.
But what makes Thomas's story so unique, so compelling, is that it gives a voice to one of the many, many unnamed soldiers who fought and died that day.
It's easy to forget sometimes that behind those historical markers, behind the famous names, there were real people with their own stories, hopes, and dreams.
Absolutely, and Thomas's story really brings that home. This young man who had already witnessed so much conflict, so much upheaval, loses his life barely 20 years old.
Well, it makes you think about the human cost of history, doesn't it? It does. It's a heartbreaking story, but a very important one to tell. And what strikes me is how meticulously it's all put together.
That's one of the things that makes the Ballad of Thomas Patrick Downing so remarkable. It reads like a movie script, but it's all meticulously researched, grounded in historical fact. Des Ryan really did an incredible job piecing together original records, accounts, and a mountain of research to bring Thomas's story to life.
Amazing what dedicated research can uncover. Well, folks, there you have it, our deep dive into the incredible life of Thomas Patrick Downing. It's a story that will stay with you long after you finish the book, trust me.
It really is an incredible story.